The Hidden Guest, a chilling cabin encounter. Late in October, my girlfriend Emma and I set off on a road trip to the quiet town of White River Junction in Vermont. We had rented a cozy little cabin nestled in the woods, just outside of town, through a site called Glamping Stays. The draw of the trip was to witness the fall foliage in full display, and White River Junction seemed like the perfect spot. We had the place booked from Thursday night to Sunday morning. The cabin sat on a picturesque hilltop, offering sweeping views of the surrounding forest, which was ablaze with autumn colors. When we arrived, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees, giving the place an almost dreamlike glow. The cabin had a digital lock system, and the owner had texted me the code earlier that day. I entered it with ease, and we stepped inside, immediately met by the warm, woody scent of a well-maintained country home. Everything inside was rustic and cozy. Wooden floors, walls, and ceilings gave the cabin a snug, welcoming atmosphere. It had an old-fashioned charm that we both adored. The layout was simple: a bathroom, a small but functional kitchen, 3 bedrooms, and a living room with a stone fireplace. For just the two of us, it was more space than we needed. There were 2 TVs, one in the living room and one in the master bedroom. One door, however, was locked, and though we assumed it was a storage closet or an unused bedroom, it sparked a bit of curiosity. Emma joked that maybe the owner kept a skeleton in there. I chuckled, but the locked door didn't bother us much at the time. We unpacked and placed most of our luggage in the second bedroom, deciding to keep the master bedroom tidy. That night, we grabbed dinner at a local bistro, walked around the small, quiet village, and then returned to the cabin to watch a movie. By the time we finished, it was late, and we turned in for the night. The next day greeted us with a brisk, cloudy morning. It was perfect for hiking, so we laced up our boots and set off to explore some nearby trails that ran through the forest around the cabin. The woods were serene, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. It was the kind of peaceful escape we had been craving. Back at the cabin, I showered while Emma relaxed in the living room. When I emerged, fresh and warm, she mentioned hearing something odd earlier. It sounded like a faint radio, she said, coming from the locked room. That's strange, I said, stepping toward the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, but it was silent. Maybe it's nothing, Emma muttered, her brow furrowed with concern. I knocked on the door lightly, just to mess with her. She scolded me for it, saying it freaked her out, but I laughed it off. After all, what could possibly be in there? Later, while Emma took her shower, I relaxed in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV. That's when I thought I heard it again. Faint, distorted voices coming from the locked room. I muted the television and walked over to the door. This time, the sound was unmistakable, like soft murmuring or a radio playing just out of range. Chills ran down my spine. I grabbed my phone and messaged the host, explaining the situation. He responded fairly quickly, saying that he wasn't sure why the door was locked, but it might be something his wife had done. As for the noises, he said he had no idea. Maybe his wife left an old radio on, he suggested, but he offered to come by and check it out. When Emma emerged from the shower, I chose not to mention what I'd heard again, hoping to keep her from worrying. We went out for lunch at a nearby restaurant, followed by a scenic drive around town. By then, it was around 4 p.m., and we decided to return to the cabin. As soon as we arrived, I noticed something odd. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. Emma hadn't noticed, but it set me on edge immediately. I grabbed her arm. "Did you close the door when we left?" I asked. "Of course," she replied, looking back toward the cabin. We entered cautiously, but everything seemed undisturbed, except for a subtle, sickly sweet odor that wasn't there before. It was almost like rotting fruit, just faint enough to be unsettling. Emma collapsed on the couch, exhausted from the day's activities, while I made an excuse to step outside. A thought occurred to me. Why hadn't I looked through the window of the locked room earlier? I crept around the side of the cabin, heart pounding. The window was uncurtained, and as I stood on my toes to peek in, my blood turned to ice. Inside the room, barely illuminated by a dim light, stood a gaunt figure, a tall, emaciated man, swaying gently in the center of the room. His face was hidden by a hood, and he clutched a small portable radio, the source of the faint voices we'd been hearing. He turned to face me, and I saw his smile, thin, stretched, grotesque. He lifted a hand and waved slowly, as if mocking me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over myself as I rushed toward the cabin. I burst through the door, yelling for Emma to get up. She was startled and confused, but the fear in my voice was enough to get her moving. "We need to leave. Now!" I shouted, grabbing our bags and shoving them into the car. Emma followed, still trying to comprehend what was happening. We sped away from the cabin, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I called the host again and told him everything. He promised to call the police immediately. We didn't stop driving until we were back in the center of town. About an hour later, the host called back. The police had arrived and searched the cabin. The locked door had been opened, but the man was gone. They found evidence that someone had been living there: food wrappers, empty bottles, and a filthy sleeping bag under the bed. Whoever he was, he had been there the entire time we were staying, hiding just behind that locked door. We stayed in a nearby motel for the rest of the weekend, though neither of us slept well. The thought that someone had been watching us, so close while we slept, left a permanent scar on both of us. The cabin had seemed like the perfect getaway, but it had turned into a waking nightmare, one I wouldn't forget for as long as I lived. The host refunded us, and we made arrangements to leave early. I couldn't shake the memory of that smiling man, his hollow eyes fixed on me through the window. Title: The Girl at the End of the Road. It was a rainy October evening when I left the hospital after my 12-hour shift. I didn't have any plans for Halloween that night, but my friend Alex had invited me to his party, and I felt guilty about skipping it. I didn't even have a costume, just my hospital scrubs. I stopped at a convenience store, grabbed some drinks to contribute, and made my way to the party. When I arrived, the small house was packed. There were probably 30 people there, most of them dressed up in costumes. I spotted Alex near the back, dressed as some kind of zombie nurse. He waved me over, but after a quick greeting, I found myself just standing awkwardly by the kitchen counter, nursing a drink. The noise and the crowd were overwhelming after such a long day. I was already tired, and the last thing I wanted was to socialize with people I didn't know. After about an hour, I decided I'd had enough. I didn't want to stick around just to be polite. I pulled an Irish goodbye, slipping out the back door and heading to my car parked a block away. As I reached the Subaru, the rain started coming down harder. I hopped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and set off. I left the music off, enjoying the sound of the rain hitting the windshield, and just wanted to get home. As I drove through the quiet, dark residential streets, something caught my eye. A girl was walking on the side of the road, drenched from head to toe. She had no umbrella, no jacket, just a simple white dress that clung to her skin in the rain. My gut instinct told me to keep driving, but something else, a strange pull, made me stop. I rolled down the window and called out to her. "Hey, do you need a ride?" She didn't respond, just turned her head and stared at me with big dark eyes. Without a word, she walked over and opened the back door, sliding into the seat behind me. There was something unsettling about her silence, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just shy or cold. "Where are you headed?" I asked, looking at her in the rearview mirror. "Just down to the end of the road," she replied in a low, soft voice. I nodded and started driving again, feeling an odd sense of discomfort creeping in. The rain seemed to intensify as we moved down the empty street. I glanced at the mirror again, but her face was obscured by the shadows in the back seat. I tried to make conversation, asking her what she was doing out in the rain, but she didn't answer. She just stared out the window. As we neared the end of the road, I noticed something strange. The road didn't just end, it led straight into a dense forest, and beyond that, there was nothing but darkness. No houses, no lights, just trees and the feeling of isolation. I slowed the car, looking back at her through the mirror. "This is the end of the road. Is this where you wanted to go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, but a cold sweat had already broken out on the back of my neck. She didn't reply. I turned around in my seat to face her directly, but she wasn't there. The back seat was empty. My heart jumped into my throat. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't heard her get out. There was no way she could have left without me noticing. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the car, frantically checking the back seat. It was dry, completely dry. There was no sign that anyone had been sitting there, despite the fact that she had been soaked. I scanned the area, but there was no one in sight, just rain and darkness. And then in the distance, I noticed something, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was her, the girl in the white dress. She was standing motionless, staring at me from the tree line. "Hey!" I shouted, but she didn't move. She just stood there, her face still and pale in the dim light from the street lamp. I don't know why, but something about the way she stared at me made every hair on my body stand on end. There was no life in her eyes. It was as though she wasn't really human. I took a step back toward my car, my heart racing. I could feel her gaze boring into me, even as I turned away. I got back in the car, slammed the door, and drove off, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't look back, afraid of what I might see. The rain continued to pour, blurring my vision, but I kept my eyes on the road, determined to get home as quickly as possible. When I finally reached my apartment, I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that girl? How had she vanished from my car? Why had she appeared at the edge of the forest? I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, unable to shake the image of her pale face and hollow eyes. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I had been exhausted, maybe even hallucinating. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That girl hadn't been real, at least not in the way I understood. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I avoided driving past that area, taking different routes to work, but the thought of her still lingered in the back of my mind. One night, out of curiosity and desperation, I searched online for any information about that road or the nearby forest. What I found chilled me to the bone. Years ago, a young woman named Lucy had disappeared in that very area. She had been walking home late at night, but she never made it. Her body was found weeks later, deep in the woods, her white dress still intact. They never caught the person responsible for her death, and her case had gone cold. But there were rumors, stories of a ghostly figure wandering the roads on rainy nights, looking for a ride to the place where she had died. My blood ran cold as I read through the accounts. It all matched. The dress, the road, the rain. I had picked up a ghost. There was no other explanation. I couldn't shake the feeling that she had chosen me for a reason, that somehow I had become part of her story. From that day on, I avoided that road at all costs. But even now, every time it rains, I can't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting there, waiting to be taken back to the end of the road. The haunting of the Ravenwood Asylum. Dr. Harold Whitman and Nurse Emily ran down the narrow gravel path that led away from the asylum, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The night sky above them was shrouded in clouds, and the only light came from the distant flicker of the asylum's windows. The sensation of being watched never left Dr. Whitman, as though the walls of Ravenwood were alive, filled with the countless eyes of whatever horrors lay within. The asylum was isolated, miles away from the nearest town, and the path ahead seemed to stretch into an unrelenting darkness. Dr. Whitman had no idea where they were headed, only that they needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the ominous building. As they rounded a bend, Emily slowed down, clutching her side and gasping for breath. "Wait, we can't keep running blindly," she said between breaths. "We need a plan." Dr. Whitman stopped, leaning heavily against a tree, trying to steady his racing heart. He glanced back at the asylum, its shadowy outline a jagged silhouette against the dark sky. For a brief moment, he could have sworn he saw movement at one of the windows, but he quickly dismissed it as paranoia. "You're right," he said, trying to think clearly. "But what's happening inside the asylum? You said this wasn't the first time something like this happened." Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "The staff knows. Most of them refuse to talk about it, but some of the older nurses, before they quit, warned me. They said the asylum is cursed." "Cursed?" Dr. Whitman repeated, his rational mind immediately rejecting the idea. "That's absurd. What we're dealing with here is a psychotic patient, a murderer. Maybe Richard. No, Emily interrupted, shaking her head. Richard is dangerous, but he's just a pawn. He's not the first patient to hear voices, to claim they're being haunted by something inside the asylum. Dr. Whitman stared at her, his skepticism faltering in the face of her desperation. What do you mean? I've worked here for 3 years, she began, her voice trembling. And I've seen things, doctor. Things I can't explain. Patients disappearing without a trace. Staff members who go missing and never return. And the ones who do, they're not the same. They don't talk about what happens, but you can see it in their eyes. Something in that place is... A loud crack echoed through the trees, cutting her off. Both of them froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound had come from somewhere nearby, like the snapping of a branch under heavy weight. Did you hear that? Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Whitman nodded, his eyes scanning the dark woods around them. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, but there was something else. A faint, low humming, almost like a chant, carried on the breeze. We need to move, Dr. Whitman whispered. Now. They resumed their hurried pace, this time more cautious, their senses on high alert. But the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees thickening, blocking out what little light there was. The path ahead was barely visible, but they pushed forward, driven by fear. After several minutes, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated old chapel, its wooden structure barely holding together. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades, yet the sight of it gave them a strange sense of relief, if only because it was far from the asylum. Emily hesitated at the edge of the clearing. What is this place? I don't know, Dr. Whitman said, wiping the sweat from his brow. But it's better than nothing. We'll rest here for a moment and figure out what to do next. The two approached the chapel cautiously. The door hanging off its hinges groaned as Dr. Whitman pushed it open. Inside, the air was damp and musty, and broken pews lay scattered across the floor. A simple altar stood at the far end, draped in cobwebs. As they entered, Emily pulled out her phone and checked the signal. Still no service. We're completely cut off. Dr. Whitman walked toward the altar, feeling the weight of exhaustion and fear pressing down on him. His logical mind was still trying to process everything. A brutal murder, a disturbed patient, and now this strange sense of being hunted. Nothing about the situation made sense. Suddenly, Emily gasped, her eyes widening in horror. Look, she cried, pointing at the far corner of the chapel. Dr. Whitman turned and froze. There, etched into the stone walls, were strange symbols, intricate carvings that looked like they had been made with something sharp. The symbols twisted and coiled in unnatural patterns, filling the entire corner with a sense of wrongness. Beneath the symbols, written in large, erratic letters, was a single word: leave. That wasn't here the last time I was in this area, Emily stammered, her voice shaking. Before Dr. Whitman could respond, the low humming they had heard earlier grew louder. It wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the chapel now. The sound seemed to emanate from the very walls, vibrating through the air like an ominous chant. We need to go, Dr. Whitman said, grabbing Emily's arm. This place isn't safe. They turned to leave, but as they approached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The chapel was plunged into darkness, and the temperature dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the freezing air. What's happening? Emily cried, her voice panicked. Dr. Whitman grabbed the door, yanking it as hard as he could, but it wouldn't budge. Something was holding it shut. Then the chanting stopped, replaced by a deep guttural whisper. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from, but it surrounded them, filling the air with an oppressive weight. They're here, the whisper said. You can't run from us. Dr. Whitman and Emily backed away from the door, their fear reaching a fever pitch. The walls of the chapel seemed to close in on them, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly, as if coming alive. The room was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the very air had turned malignant. We're not alone, Dr. Whitman whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows. Whatever was in the asylum, it followed us here. Emily clutched his arm, her voice trembling. What do we do? For a moment, Dr. Whitman's mind was blank, his logical, scientific approach to life failing him in the face of such inexplicable terror. But then something occurred to him, something Richard had said in his delusional ramblings. They told me to leave. I don't belong here. Was that a warning? A clue? Emily, Dr. Whitman said, his voice firm despite his fear. We need to get back to the asylum. What? Emily stared at him in disbelief. Are you insane? We just ran from there. I know, but there's something we're missing. Something Richard was trying to tell us. We need to find him. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if urging them to stay. You won't escape, it hissed, but Dr. Whitman refused to listen. He grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her toward the door again. This time, with a tremendous effort, the door creaked open. The cold night air rushed in, and they stumbled out into the darkness. The asylum loomed in the distance, its windows like watching eyes. But this time, Dr. Whitman wasn't running away. He was heading straight back into the heart of the nightmare. As Dr. Whitman and Emily made their way back toward the asylum, a palpable sense of dread weighed down on them. The path ahead was the same, yet it felt more sinister now, as if the forest itself was conspiring against them. Shadows shifted among the trees, and the once faint whispering seemed to echo in every gust of wind, taunting their every step. The asylum loomed closer, its dark silhouette growing larger as they approached. The building was even more foreboding now than it had been before. The windows, which had seemed like empty eyes before, now glowed faintly with a sickly yellow light. The sense that something ancient and malevolent was waiting for them inside was overwhelming. But Dr. Whitman was resolute. He couldn't shake the feeling that Richard held the key to everything. If they could just find him, if they could understand what he had been trying to say, they might be able to make sense of the madness that had descended upon them. As they neared the asylum, Emily slowed, her voice shaking. Harold, are you sure about this? Going back in there, it feels like a death sentence. Dr. Whitman hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure of anything anymore, but something about Richard's words haunted him. The cryptic warnings, the strange carvings on the walls of the chapel, the chilling voice in the darkness, it all pointed back to the asylum. He knew they couldn't escape this nightmare without confronting the source of it. I don't know what's happening here, Dr. Whitman admitted, his voice grim, but I know running won't save us. We need answers, and Richard might be the only one who can give them to us. Emily bit her lip, fear clearly etched in her features, but she nodded. Okay, we'll find him, and then we'll get out. With a deep breath, they crossed the threshold of the asylum once again, the heavy front doors creaking as they pushed them open. The air inside was thick and oppressive, the faint scent of decay lingering in the hallways. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of electricity in the walls. The asylum was eerily quiet, as if all its inhabitants, staff and patients alike, had vanished into thin air. The only sound was the echo of their footsteps as they walked deeper into the building. Richard's room is on the 3rd floor, Dr. Whitman said, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll start there. They ascended the staircase, the creaking of the old wood beneath their feet heightening their sense of unease. As they reached the 2nd floor, the lights flickered above them, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. When they arrived at the 3rd floor, they found the hallway dark and foreboding. Dr. Whitman's hand shook as he reached for the door to Richard's room, his mind racing with the possibilities of what they might find inside. The door creaked open, revealing the small, padded cell. The walls were bare, except for the now familiar carvings that adorned every surface. The symbols were crude but unmistakable, the same ones they had seen in the chapel. In the corner of the room, huddled on the floor, was Richard. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, and he rocked back and forth, muttering to himself. His once clean-shaven face was now covered in a scraggly beard, and his clothes hung loosely on his thin frame. But it was the look in his eyes that sent a chill down Dr. Whitman's spine. Richard wasn't just scared. He was terrified, haunted by something only he could see. Richard, Dr. Whitman called softly, kneeling in front of him. It's Dr. Whitman. We need to talk. Richard's muttering stopped abruptly, and he looked up, his gaze locking with Dr. Whitman's. For a moment, he said nothing, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for something in the shadows. They're here, Richard whispered finally, his voice hoarse and trembling. They never leave. They're always watching. Who, Richard? Dr. Whitman pressed. Who's watching? The ones beneath, Richard muttered, his eyes wild with fear. The ones that whisper in the dark. They're everywhere, Doctor. In the walls, in the floors, in our minds. Emily stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Richard, we saw the symbols, the ones on the walls. What do they mean? How do we stop this? Richard shook his head violently, his hands clutching at his hair. You can't stop them. No one can. They're ancient, older than the asylum, older than us. They've always been here, waiting, feeding. Dr. Whitman frowned, trying to make sense of what Richard was saying. Feeding on what? Fear, Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. Pain, despair. They feed on us, on our suffering. That's why they're drawn to places like this. They thrive on it. Dr. Whitman's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information. If what Richard was saying was true, if there were some kind of malevolent entities that fed on the emotions of the asylum's inhabitants, it would explain the strange occurrences, the disappearances, the overwhelming sense of dread that had permeated the building. But why now? Dr. Whitman asked. Why is this happening now? Richard's eyes darted toward the door, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Because they're awake. Something woke them up, Doctor, and now they won't stop until they've consumed everything. A cold shiver ran down Dr. Whitman's spine. What woke them up, Richard? What caused this? Before Richard could answer, the lights flickered again, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The air became heavy, thick with an unseen presence. Dr. Whitman and Emily both felt it, a dark, oppressive force closing in around them. They're coming, Richard whimpered, curling into a ball. They're coming for us. Suddenly, the walls began to groan and creak, the carvings glowing faintly as if infused with a sinister energy. The oppressive presence in the room grew stronger, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Shadows stretched and twisted along the walls, moving of their own accord. Harold, we need to get out of here, Emily whispered urgently, her eyes wide with fear. But before Dr. Whitman could respond, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The air crackled with energy, and a deep, guttural whisper filled the room, louder than ever before. You cannot escape us. The words seemed to reverberate in their minds as if the voice came from within them rather than from the walls. The shadows began to take shape, forming grotesque, twisted figures that loomed over them, their faces hidden in the darkness. Dr. Whitman's heart raced as he realized the truth. They weren't dealing with a delusion or a curse. They were dealing with something far older, far more dangerous. And it had already marked them. The room felt like a living nightmare. The grotesque figures, their bodies made of nothing but shifting shadows, closed in on Dr. Whitman, Emily, and Richard. Their whispers grew louder, more chaotic, clawing at the edges of their sanity. Dr. Whitman's mind was racing. The oppressive force in the room felt like it was squeezing the life out of him, his breathing shallow and labored. He glanced over at Emily, who was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror, and Richard, curled in the corner, rocking back and forth like a madman. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as if the asylum was alive and feeding on their fear. With a surge of determination, Dr. Whitman grabbed Emily's arm. We need to move, he whispered urgently. Whatever these things are, they're getting stronger the longer we stay here. Emily nodded, though her face was pale and her body trembled. She glanced at the door, which had slammed shut with an ominous finality. How do we get out? The door. Dr. Whitman's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The door was no longer an option, but maybe. His gaze landed on the window, the only barrier between them and the outside world. Help me, Dr. Whitman said, moving toward the window. He grabbed a nearby chair, hoisting it above his head and bringing it down with all his strength. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards scattering across the floor. The cold night air rushed into the room, a brief reprieve from the suffocating darkness inside. Without a word, Dr. Whitman gestured for Emily to climb through. She hesitated for a second, looking back at Richard, who was still huddled in the corner, mumbling incoherently to himself. We can't leave him, Emily whispered, fear and guilt battling in her eyes. Dr. Whitman cursed under his breath. He knew she was right, but every second they stayed increased their risk. The figures in the room were growing more distinct, their forms becoming solid, the whispers intensifying, drilling into their skulls. Richard, Dr. Whitman said, moving toward the broken man, we need to leave, now. This is our only chance. Richard didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the ground as if in a trance. The carvings on the walls glowed even brighter now, casting an unnatural light over the room. Dr. Whitman grabbed Richard's arm, trying to pull him to his feet, but the man was unresponsive, as if his body had gone limp. Emily knelt beside them, her voice trembling as she pleaded with him. "Please, Richard, you have to come with us. We'll help you, but you have to move." Suddenly, Richard's head snapped up, his eyes wide and frantic. "You don't understand," he screamed, his voice hoarse and panicked. "They won't let us go. They've already claimed us." At that moment, the grotesque figures surged forward, their shadowy forms solidifying into something far worse. Their faces were twisted and featureless, but their mouths opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, dripping with darkness. One of the creatures lunged at Dr. Whitman, its clawed hand swiping at him with terrifying speed. He barely dodged the attack, stumbling backward as the creature's claw grazed his arm, sending a jolt of pain through his body. Emily screamed, scrambling toward the window as the creatures closed in. "Go!" Dr. Whitman shouted to Emily, pushing her toward the shattered glass. "I'll hold them off." Emily hesitated for a split second, her eyes wide with fear, but she knew there was no time. She clambered through the window, cutting her hands on the shards of glass, but she didn't care. She dropped down onto the cold ground below, gasping for breath as she looked back up at Dr. Whitman. Dr. Whitman turned to Richard, who was still frozen in fear. "Richard, please," he begged, grabbing the man's arm once again. But Richard's body remained slack, his mind seemingly lost to the darkness. The shadow creatures advanced, their movements slow but deliberate, their mouths opening and closing with sickening clicks. "Richard! Dr." Whitman shouted one last time, but it was too late. One of the creatures lunged forward, its mouth widening unnaturally as it enveloped Richard's form in a shroud of darkness. The man's screams were muffled, then silenced entirely, swallowed by the void. Dr. Whitman's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had no choice. He couldn't save Richard now. With a heavy heart, he turned and sprinted toward the window, throwing himself through the opening, just as the shadowy figures swarmed the room behind him. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his body, but he didn't stop. Emily was already running, her footsteps pounding on the dirt path, and Dr. Whitman scrambled to his feet, chasing after her. The whispers followed them, echoing in their minds, but they didn't dare look back. The asylum receded into the distance as they ran, its dark silhouette slowly swallowed by the night. But the sense of terror lingered, gnawing at their minds as they fled through the forest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the edge of the woods, emerging onto the road. Both of them collapsed, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. For a long moment, they just lay there, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Dr. Whitman's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. What had they just encountered? What were those creatures? How had the asylum fallen under their control? "We need to go back," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to tell someone. Anyone." Dr. Whitman shook his head, his face pale. "No one will believe us." Emily fell silent, staring up at the dark sky above them. The whispers had stopped, but they lingered in the back of her mind, a haunting reminder that something ancient and evil still lurked in the asylum. Dr. Whitman sat up, his eyes narrowing as he looked back toward the forest. He knew they couldn't stay here, couldn't let this darkness spread. Whatever they had unleashed wasn't confined to the asylum anymore. It was out there, waiting for the next victim, feeding on fear and despair. "We need to stop it," Dr. Whitman said quietly, his voice resolute, "before it's too late." Emily looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "How?" Dr. Whitman didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing for certain: they couldn't run forever. As Dr. Whitman and Emily trudged through the dense forest, the echoes of the crumbling asylum faded into the distance. Their hearts raced, adrenaline still pumping, but an eerie calm surrounded them. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, making the path muddy and difficult to traverse. Whitman's mind was clouded with thoughts of the horrors they had witnessed, but his focus now was survival. "We have to get out of these woods before nightfall," he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. Emily, though visibly shaken, clutched the journal tighter. "Do you think we're really safe?" "What if they followed us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Whitman glanced back over his shoulder. The forest was thick, shadows blending into one another, making it impossible to tell if anything was out there. "We're safer than we were back there, but I can't say for certain. We need to keep moving." They continued in silence, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves making them jump. As the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, the temperature dropped, sending a chill through the air. Whitman glanced at Emily, noticing the exhaustion etched into her face. She was struggling, but still determined. "We can't stop now," he urged. "Not until we're sure we've put enough distance between us and that place." Just as they reached the edge of the forest, Whitman froze in his tracks. Ahead of them was a small clearing, and in the center stood an old, decrepit house. Its wooden walls were gray with age, the windows dark and lifeless. It didn't seem like a good place to stop, but it was the only shelter they had found. "We should keep going," Emily whispered, her eyes locked on the house. Whitman hesitated, but the weight of fatigue was too much to bear. "We need rest. We'll stay here for the night and leave at first light." Reluctantly, Emily followed him toward the house. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew as they pushed open the creaky door. Inside, the house was surprisingly well kept compared to its exterior, though it was clear no one had lived there for years. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like lace. Whitman lit a lantern he had found on a small table, casting a dim glow around the room. "We'll take turns keeping watch," he said. "I'll go first." Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the shadows nervously. She sat down on an old, dusty couch and pulled the journal into her lap. As Whitman paced near the window, his eyes focused on the outside world, Emily's curiosity got the better of her. She flipped open the journal, her fingers tracing the words of Dr. Penfield. Whitman glanced over. "Anything new?" Emily shook her head. "It's mostly just notes on the patients and the experiments, but there's something strange. The entries stop abruptly, as if a loud creak interrupted her, coming from the floor above. Whitman immediately grabbed a nearby broken chair leg, using it as a makeshift weapon. Emily froze, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she whispered. Whitman motioned for her to stay quiet. He tiptoed toward the staircase that led to the second floor, listening carefully. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, as if something or someone was moving above them. Whitman swallowed hard. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice firm. But Emily shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not staying alone." Together, they ascended the creaking stairs, each step groaning under their weight. The air grew colder the higher they went, and a musty smell filled their nostrils. At the top of the stairs was a long hallway, lined with doors on either side. A single door at the far end of the hall was slightly ajar, the source of the noise. Whitman raised his makeshift weapon as they approached the door. He nudged it open with his foot, revealing a darkened room. It looked like an old bedroom, dusty, with tattered curtains and broken furniture scattered across the floor. And then they saw it. In the center of the room stood a tall, shadowy figure. It was hunched over, its back turned to them, but they could hear the slow, raspy breaths it took. Its form was human-like but distorted, its arms unnaturally long, fingers ending in sharp points that dragged across the floor. Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The creature turned slowly, revealing a grotesque face. Its eyes were hollow pits, its mouth stretched into a jagged grin. It let out a low growl, a sound that reverberated through the room. "Run!" Whitman shouted, grabbing Emily's arm. They bolted back down the stairs, their footsteps thundering through the house. The creature's growl grew louder, echoing behind them as it pursued them with terrifying speed. Whitman and Emily burst through the front door and sprinted into the forest, their hearts pounding in their chests. They ran for what felt like hours, the shadowy figure never far behind. It moved through the trees with unnatural agility, always just out of sight but close enough to hear its breath. Finally, they stumbled upon a narrow dirt road, and to their surprise, headlights appeared in the distance. A truck was heading toward them. Whitman waved his arms frantically, signaling for the driver to stop. The truck screeched to a halt, and a grizzled old man leaned out of the window. "What the hell are you two doing out here?" he barked. "No time to explain," Whitman gasped. "We need to get out of here now." The old man glanced over their shoulders, his face paling as he spotted the shadowy figure approaching the edge of the forest. "Get in!" he yelled. Whitman and Emily scrambled into the truck, and the old man hit the gas, tires screeching as they sped away. Whitman glanced out the back window, watching as the shadowy creature disappeared into the darkness of the forest, its hollow eyes still watching them. As the truck sped down the road, Whitman and Emily exchanged a glance. They had escaped, for now. But the shadow of the asylum and its horrors still loomed over them, and they knew deep down that this nightmare was far from over. Whatever had been unleashed in those woods was still out there, waiting. Echoes of Ashford Heights. Ashford Heights was the quintessential American suburb, a picturesque town where community gatherings and friendly waves were the norm. The streets were lined with well-kept homes, their yards adorned with seasonal decorations. As autumn approached, the town prepared for Halloween, eagerly anticipating the festivities that marked the season. The atmosphere was one of cozy anticipation, but beneath this veneer of normalcy, a dark and sinister force was beginning to stir. The town's annual Halloween parade was one of the highlights of the year, with neighbors and friends gathering to enjoy the colorful floats and costumes. Families lined the streets, children darted around in costumes, and the air was filled with laughter and the scent of caramel apples. But behind the festive facade, a shadow loomed over Ashford Heights, threatening to unravel the fabric of its seemingly perfect existence. It all began in late September when Grace Mitchell, a beloved librarian and active community member, vanished without a trace. Grace had been a pillar of the town, known for her dedication to the local library and her volunteer work at various community events. Her husband, Tom Mitchell, was well known in town for his quiet demeanor and support for Grace's various causes. Grace had set out for a walk in the late afternoon, a routine she cherished for its tranquility and the chance to unwind from her busy day. When she failed to return home by nightfall, Tom grew increasingly concerned. He first tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. With mounting worry, Tom contacted the local police, and soon the town was engulfed in a search operation. Detective Sarah Lawson, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving intricate cases, was assigned to the disappearance. Sarah, with her sharp mind and intuitive skills, quickly realized that Grace's disappearance was out of character. The search efforts were extensive, involving volunteers, local police, and even search dogs. The community rallied together, organizing searches and distributing flyers, but no trace of Grace was found. The town's residents were filled with anxiety and fear, as Grace was well loved and her sudden absence left a gaping hole in the community. A week later, the town was rocked by the discovery of Grace's body in a secluded park on the edge of town. The scene was nothing short of horrific. Grace's body was found arranged in a macabre display, surrounded by scattered books and eerie symbols drawn in the dirt. The arrangement seemed ritualistic, with the books forming a semicircle around her body, each one open to pages that bore disturbing illustrations. The sight was a chilling tableau that suggested a deliberate and methodical killer. Detective Lawson, along with Chief Mark Dawson, who had been overseeing the investigation, meticulously examined the scene. The symbols and the arrangement hinted at a deeper motive, something beyond mere random violence. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the crime was part of a larger, more sinister pattern. The murder of Grace Mitchell was just the beginning. The community's shock was palpable, and the fear that gripped Ashford Heights was tangible. The once peaceful streets now seemed ominous, and every corner was scrutinized with suspicion. The town's normal routine was upended, and the search for Grace's killer became a central focus of everyone's lives. As the days passed, the anxiety in Ashford Heights grew. The local police, led by Chief Dawson, worked tirelessly to reassure the community and pursue leads, but their efforts were in vain, as no new evidence emerged and the case began to grow cold. Then, tragedy struck again. Emily Carter, a single mother of two who had been active in organizing the town's Halloween parade, went missing. Emily was known for her generosity and community spirit, and her disappearance sent shockwaves through the town. Her two young children, Ethan and Ava, were left in the care of relatives, their lives turned upside down by their mother's sudden absence. The The search for Emily was as exhaustive as the one for Grace. Yet, despite the best efforts of the town's residents and authorities, no trace of Emily was found. The town's once vibrant Halloween preparations were overshadowed by a deepening sense of dread. The vibrant decorations and festive events became stark reminders of the horrors that lurked beneath the surface. The community's anxiety turned to dread when Emily's body was discovered a week later in a similar setting to Grace's. The parallels between the two crime scenes were unmistakable. Emily's body was found in a local pumpkin patch, surrounded by Halloween decorations arranged in a disturbing manner. The killer's method was becoming increasingly apparent, and the pattern was causing mounting fear among the townspeople. Detective Lawson, grappling with the gravity of the situation, knew that the killer was targeting individuals with connections to the community. The methodical nature of the crimes indicated that the perpetrator was someone who understood the town's routines and knew how to exploit its vulnerabilities. Sarah began focusing on individuals who had close ties to the victims, hoping that one of them might reveal a crucial lead. The investigation centered on 4 key individuals who had been particularly close to the victims. Emily Davis, a friendly neighbor and close friend of Grace Mitchell. Emily had often been seen at Grace's house, helping with various community events. Her deep connection to Grace made her a person of interest, but her concern for her missing friend seemed genuine. David Carter, a fellow schoolteacher and close friend of Michael Thompson. David had been involved in the town's educational activities and had a history of heated disagreements with Michael. His frequent arguments with Michael had drawn attention, but he was also known for his dedication to his students. Lisa Grant, a local artist who had been working on decorations for the Halloween parade. Lisa was known for her creative talent and had been seen in close proximity to the crime scenes. Her involvement in the parade made her a potential link to the killer, but her artistic flair and enthusiasm seemed out of place with the grim reality of the murders. Mark Reynolds, the town's handyman, known for his work around the community. Mark had been a familiar face in various neighborhoods and had recently been seen near the locations of the murders. His presence in multiple areas made him a person of interest, but his role as a handyman also meant he had legitimate reasons to be around. As the investigation dragged on, the tension in Ashford Heights escalated. The once vibrant town now felt like a place under siege where fear lurked around every corner. Parents kept their children close, and the Halloween festivities, which were usually a source of joy, had become a source of dread. The decorations and celebrations that once symbolized the town's unity now served as reminders of the danger. Detective Lawson continued to probe into the lives of the few individuals of interest. Emily Davis, David Carter, Lisa Grant, Mark Reynolds each had their own stories and alibis, and Sarah couldn't argument with Michael Thompson had drawn suspicion. Sarah's team began to scrutinize David's activities and connections more closely, searching for any indication that he might be involved in the murders. With 3 victims and mounting pressure to solve the case, Sarah intensified her focus on David Carter. David's interactions with the victims, his erratic behavior, and his presence at the crime scenes all contributed to the growing suspicion. Sarah decided to confront David, hoping to extract a confession or gain crucial evidence. During the interrogation, David's demeanor shifted from defensiveness to agitation. He initially denied any involvement in the murders, but his responses became increasingly erratic. David admitted to being at the scenes of the crimes, but claimed that he had been there for unrelated reasons. The breakthrough came when Sarah discovered hidden evidence in David's home, a series of disturbing journals detailing the killer's thoughts and plans. The journals revealed a deep-seated resentment toward the town and its residents. David's motivations stemmed from a feeling of being undervalued and overlooked, despite his significant contributions to the community. The murders were his twisted way of gaining attention and asserting his presence. Sarah's team found additional evidence linking David to the murders, including personal items from the victims and the disturbing journals that detailed his plans and emotions. David was arrested and charged with the murders, and his trial became a media sensation. With David Carter in custody, the town of Ashford Heights began the process of healing. The fear and anxiety that had gripped the community slowly faded, but the scars of the tragedy remained. The once peaceful town had been forever changed by the actions of one of their own. Detective Sarah Lawson, though relieved to have solved the case, was haunted by the memories of the victims and the impact of the murders on the community. Ashford Heights would remember the echoes of the tragedy for years to come, a somber reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the facade of suburban tranquility. The town eventually began to rebuild, finding solace in their shared strength and resilience. The Halloween festivities resumed, but with a newfound sense of vigilance and a lingering memory of the darkness that had once overshadowed their lives. The community came together to support the victims' families and honor their memories, determined to reclaim their sense of safety and unity. As the years passed, Ashford Heights continued to remember the victims and the lessons learned from the tragedy. The town's sense of community, once tested by fear and violence, grew stronger, and the echoes of the past became a reminder of the resilience and strength of the people who called Ashford Heights home. The Midnight Harvest. Nestled in the rolling hills of rural Kentucky, Meadowbrook was a town known for its serene landscapes and close-knit community. Its charm lay in its simplicity: rustic farms, friendly neighbors, and a slow pace of life. The town's most prominent feature was its annual Harvest Festival, which celebrated the end of the harvest season with parades, fairs, and bountiful feasts. This year's festival was particularly significant as it marked the 150th anniversary of the town's founding. The excitement was palpable, with vibrant banners strung across streets, food stalls lining the town square, and carnival rides ready for the influx of visitors and locals. The town's residents had been working tirelessly to make the festival a memorable event. The preparations included decorating the streets with autumnal hues, setting up a corn maze, and organizing a grand parade featuring antique tractors and homemade floats. Meadowbrook was buzzing with the energy of anticipation, but beneath the surface, an undercurrent of unease began to stir. The first incident. The first sign of trouble came when Emily Ross, a local schoolteacher and a beloved member of the community, went missing. Emily had been heavily involved in organizing the festival, coordinating various activities, and ensuring everything was in place for the big event. Her sudden disappearance was met with growing concern and confusion. Her husband, Sam Ross, reported her missing after she failed to return home from running errands for the festival. Sam's frantic search for Emily quickly mobilized the town, but as the days turned into a week with no sign of her, the sense of dread grew stronger. The local authorities, initially hopeful that Emily would return safely, were soon confronted with the grim reality of the situation. Detective Laura Hayes, a seasoned investigator from a nearby city, was called in to lead the investigation. Laura had recently moved to Meadowbrook and was still familiarizing herself with the town's dynamics. The case was unsettling from the start. Emily's disappearance was compounded by the eerie absence of any clues. Then, a chilling discovery was made. Emily's body was found in a nearby cornfield, her body partially concealed among the tall stalks. The scene was unsettling, a macabre display of Emily's body surrounded by carved pumpkins with eerie, vacant eyes. The pumpkins were arranged in a disturbing fashion, suggesting a grotesque tribute to the festival. The sight was both haunting and puzzling, sending waves of shock through the town. The once cheerful cornfield had become a crime scene, and the festive atmosphere was tainted by the grim reality of the murder. Detective Hayes immediately began her investigation by interviewing those closest to Emily. The suspects included Sam Ross, Emily's husband, who had been deeply involved in the festival preparations. His distress and the fact that he was one of the last people to see Emily raised suspicion, though his genuine grief seemed to point away from guilt. Lydia Thompson, the town's head of the festival committee and Emily's colleague. Lydia had been working closely with Emily on the festival plans. The two women had recently had a heated argument over the direction of the festival, making Lydia a person of interest. Jake Miller, a local farmer and regular volunteer at the festival. Jake had been seen near the cornfield where Emily's body was discovered. His familiarity with the area and his somewhat surly demeanor made him a potential suspect. Olivia Green, a young artist who had been commissioned to create decorations for the festival. Olivia had a history of mental health issues and had been seen acting erratically in the days leading up to Emily's disappearance. The investigation uncovered several clues, but nothing concrete. Laura found herself navigating a web of small-town secrets and hidden resentments. Each suspect had a plausible alibi, but also a potential motive. The case seemed to stall as Detective Hayes struggled to find a breakthrough. Just as the investigation appeared to be losing momentum, another tragedy struck. Rachel Johnson, a local waitress known for her kind heart and dedication to the town's elderly residents, was reported missing. Rachel had been a familiar face around town, and her sudden disappearance was met with disbelief and fear. Her disappearance mirrored Emily's in its suddenness and the growing sense of unease among the townspeople. A week later, Rachel's body was discovered in a similarly disturbing scene. Her body was placed in the center of a makeshift altar made of harvested corn and pumpkins, with candles arranged around her in a circle. The ritualistic nature of the arrangement suggested that the killer was using the festival's theme to mask their heinous acts. The town's fear escalated as the realization set in that they were dealing with a serial killer who was escalating their pattern. Detective Hayes and her team faced mounting pressure as the town's sense of safety eroded. The investigation took on a new urgency, with the townspeople growing increasingly anxious. The festival's preparations continued, but the joy of the event was overshadowed by the growing terror. Detective Hayes decided to delve deeper into the lives of the suspects. Sam Ross's grief and distress seemed genuine, but his presence at the scene of both crimes was troubling. Lydia Thompson's knowledge of the town's history and her involvement in the festival made her a prime suspect. Her recent argument with Emily over the festival's direction suggested a motive, but Lydia's alibi during the time of the murders was solid. Jake Miller, the farmer, had been in the cornfield on the day of Rachel's murder, but his presence was explained by his regular work schedule. Olivia Green, the artist, had exhibited strange behavior, but seemed to have an alibi supported by multiple witnesses. As Laura examined the evidence, she found herself grappling with the complexity of the case. A breakthrough came when Laura reviewed the town's historical records and uncovered a local legend about a mysterious figure known as the Harvest Keeper. According to the legend, the Harvest Keeper performed ritualistic acts during harvest time to ensure a bountiful crop. The similarities between the murders and the rituals described in the legend were striking. Laura realized that the killer's actions were eerily similar to the ancient rites described in the legend. Laura decided to revisit each suspect with this new perspective. Her investigation led her to a hidden room in Lydia Thompson's house. The room contained a collection of old books, notes about harvest rituals, and detailed plans for the festival decorations. Lydia's fascination with the town's history and her recent obsession with the legend took on new significance. Confronting Lydia, Laura learned that Lydia had been deeply influenced by the local legend. Lydia admitted that she had become obsessed with ensuring the town's prosperity through ritualistic acts. She believed that the festival needed to honor the old ways and that sacrifices were necessary to ensure a bountiful harvest. Lydia's argument with Emily had been about the festival's direction, which she felt was straying from tradition. Her obsession with the legend had driven her to commit the murders, believing she was performing a ritual to secure the town's future. Lydia's confession revealed the depths of her delusion and the extent to which her fixation on the legend had twisted her sense of morality. The ritualistic nature of the crime scenes was a reflection of her distorted belief in the need for sacrifices. The townspeople were shocked and horrified to learn that one of their own had committed such heinous acts under the guise of tradition. With Lydia Thompson in custody, Meadowbrook faced the task of processing the shock of the revelations. The Harvest Festival continued, but the atmosphere was subdued. The once joyful celebration became a symbol of the town's resilience and recovery. The festival's organizers worked to honor the victims and support their families, ensuring that the event became a testament to the community's strength. Detective Laura Hayes was commended for her thorough investigation and her role in solving the case. Meadowbrook, though forever changed by the events, began to heal and rebuild. The Harvest Festival was reimagined as a celebration of community unity and strength, rather than just a harvest tradition. The legend of the Harvest Keeper became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dark side of human nature that can emerge from seemingly innocent beliefs. The town learned to cherish its values of togetherness and vigilance, knowing that even in the most peaceful settings, darkness can sometimes lurk just beneath the surface. As the years passed, Meadowbrook continued to honor the memories of the victims and the lessons learned from the tragedy. The town's sense of community, once tested by fear and violence, grew stronger. The Harvest Festival remained a cherished tradition, now imbued with a deeper sense of gratitude and solidarity. In the end, Meadowbrook's story became one of resilience and recovery, a testament to the strength of a community that faced its darkest fears and emerged united. The echoes of the past served as a reminder of the importance of vigilance and the power of collective strength in the face of adversity.